Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And, as many of you know who listen on a regular basis, on a frequent basis, we have been digging in more and more around kind of all things AI. And one of the things that I don't know we've dug in enough about and that we get questions about all the time is how do I start securing these things? Whether it's, actually securing the applications themselves, securing the environment, securing how information is both, brought into models, but also shared out via the application. And today we get a chance to really sort of dive into that. And so very, very excited to have Andy Manoske, who is VP of Products at Kindo, joining us. Andy, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into kind of all things security around AI, you've got a really interesting background around security. You've done some really interesting things, but give folks, a quick background as well as kind of where your focus is these days at Kindo.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Andy Manoske. I am the VP of Product here at Kindo. And Kindo is a company that's really focused on generative AI for DevSecOps. Really, how do we leverage generative AI to address tedious manual aspects of either tasks or whole runbooks related to either on DevOps side of things, managing infrastructure, or on the security ops side of things, like managing responses to security events, et cetera. I myself come to this role really from an interesting combination of offensive and defensive security. So prior to Kindo, I was the product lead for security products at HashiCorp. I joined HashiCorp as the first product manager and led the development of Vault Enterprise, Boundary, and Radar, as well as their M&A unit, and then also their federal and DoD unit. And prior to HashiCorp, had kind of an interesting combination of both offensive and defensive security background. I came into security kind of from the traditional defense route. So I originally worked at NetApp as their head of encryption, as well as their head of product security for defense-related initiatives. So whether that was their private cloud and public cloud work for encrypting large-scale storage, or on duty projects like Black Cloud, which was kind of the precursor to GovCloud and SC2S within AWS. Basically, how do you manage and protect access to classified data?
Yep.
The defensive side as well as the offensive side. So I was the product lead for a research lab called Alien Vault Labs, and led the development of something called Open Threat Exchange, which is one of the primary, or OTX, which is one of the primary open source threat intelligence networks, and worked on threat attribution. I think probably most notably the 2014 cyber attack on Sony Pictures, which was we attributed to the Korean People's Army as part of their attacks on Sony in relation to the movie The Interview.
Right, absolutely. Funny story, just a little anecdote. Years and years ago, when we first started the podcast, Aaron and I, my co-host, went out to San Francisco. We met with Armand and Mitchell and Kevin, who were really kind of the first three guys doing HashiCorp back in a little tiny room. They all sat in the same room. And we were kind of getting to know them. And I remember we were sort of off to the side at one point, and we were like, where do you guys think you're going? What do you think you're working on? And everybody knew about Terraform at the time. And Kevin sort of pulled us aside and he said, don't tell anybody, but we're really a security company. Like, we make all our money in security. We're really a security company. And so we always kind of kept that to ourselves. But yeah, no, it's good to sort of see this come full circle. I want to start with kind of a high level question. Obviously, like you talked about, you come from a very deep, rich security background. I feel like every time I talk to anybody in the security space, there's always a little bit of, especially if you're, building products to try and help protect things, there's always a sense of the attackers, the bad guys, the folks on the outside always have more tools, more time, more opportunities to attack. And you're always, at the perspective of like, if you get one thing wrong, everybody knows about it, whereas they can get things wrong all day long. To a certain extent, that always feels like a little bit of an unwinnable game, or it feels like a game in which you're always struggling. As you're starting to think about AI and where it fits in this, is that potentially the thing that starts to make the playing field a little more level, or is that kind of the way to start thinking about this? Is how to make the resources a little more realistic for being able to keep things secure?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I do think it is. And to frame why I think that's the case, to step back, when you look at most adversaries, professional adversaries over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, what they've had on their side is the fact that there has been a significant difference in how fast automation tools have allowed adversaries to develop novel attacks, as well as to really use non-novel attacks in highly scalable ways, versus defensive tooling that has tried to keep pace with that largely. And, in some areas has been very good at that. but in many areas has not been as good as that. Not as a function of like any of the vendors not doing a good enough job, or technology not doing a good job, but just the incentive structure, et cetera, is
Right.
just not favor the defender.
Right.
I think what AI changes as part of this is the fact that we can actually rapidly allow defenders to be able to scale at a similar pace, if not the same pace as adversaries can. And more importantly, I learned about security coming from a defense background, really in the same way that we think about conflict and you think about things like war. And when it comes to security, I think less about the kind of defender's dilemma and more as an adversary, right? Like, what is the calculus for me to actually launch a cyber attack? What AI does is it potentially allows us to be able to change that calculus a little bit, which allows us to change the calculus of like, maybe I'm not exploiting an adversary that doesn't have the same kind of like incentive structure or defensive tooling necessary. Maybe they can scale as fast as I do. And if that's the case, that changes the calculus from this and ultimately becomes more of like a deterrence effect rather than sort of a adversaries always win or the defender's dilemma kind of like way of looking at things.
Right. Yeah. And that's the other part that always gets talked about is, it's not a matter of if you're getting attacked, it's how difficult do you make it? Because obviously, people are looking for, just the easier way to get to things that are valuable. And so the more difficult you can make that. As you're thinking about that, right, you sort of laid out very articulately, this starts to change the equation of why you'd go after somebody or how difficult it is. When you start to introduce AI into it, like what's the framework to thinking about that, right? Are you thinking about it in terms of how fast you can scale up resources? Is it how fast you can teach the systems about what's possible? What are kind of the big picture things you're thinking about as you start to introduce AI as a way of creating deterrence?
Yeah, great question. I think one thing that's that I would caveat this with is that with generative AI, there's a lot of hype, right? There's a lot of like overuse of like this can bring us like novel or magical, almost new capabilities. I would argue against that. That's not really what generative AI can do. What really it brings to security is it levels the internal playing field with defenders in a skill gap issue, and B, really a way to instrument technology differently that's more broadly accessible. On the skill gap side of things, within most security organizations or within most like enterprises, you typically don't have access to dedicated security resources or backgrounds for teams. Additionally, so if anything that can help maximize the capability of, hey, our one threat intelligence person has like such limited time, how do I get them and their resources and their knowledge to the other 100 people on my team? Or maybe I don't have an offensive security background or like a red team. How do I get my defenders, who may not even be security people, to be able to actually like augment their resources and respond to attacks properly is one aspect. The other part is that what generative AI is very good at is responding to queries and requests in natural language, which I think when you look at the evolution of infrastructure, we have moved to a world where infrastructure as code is normal, right? Where I have infrastructure defined as a function of code. When I have a highly structured base of highly relevant data that requires analytical questions, responses to it, that's where large language models and generative AI really shine. And in infrastructure as code, that means that we can actually have generative AI read, understand, and then take use of this infrastructure to be able to render change in a very approachable and tactile way to a human being, but simultaneously something that is like contextually relevant and understandable to the machine intelligence that ultimately is responding to and taking action upon that human being.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I want to dive a little bit into Kindo as well as some things that you guys do on the open source side of things. There is an open source project that you guys have put out called WhiteRabbitNeo, and it's we'll put links in the show notes. Folks can dig into it. But there was an interesting sort of line in some of the announcements that came out, and it said WhiteRabbitNeo is uncensored and trained to act in a modern like a modern adversary. What does uncensored mean in that context? It's sort of framed as if a lot of things in models are kind of pre-canned, and unfortunately, the reality is adversaries are always looking for new and unique and novel ways to do that. So, what does that uncensored piece mean, and why is that really important?
Yeah, so when you look at the evolution of large language models right now, there is a phenomenal amount of work being done by companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, on models like O1 or Claude to really improve their ability to understand and take like use of technology. Just like the infrastructure as code example I gave, right? There's a lot of work being done to make sure that things like Claude can understand infrastructure as code and then take action accordingly.
Right.
One of the challenges, though, is that with security, how to properly be a good SecOps analyst in DevOps, how to properly render resilient or defend your infrastructure against an adversary means learning a skill set that inherently is dual use. And when I mean dual use here, I mean the idea that if I want to know how to build a great wall, I need to know how to blow up walls. And the censorship aspect here is really a function of, most foundation models, as they increasingly get better at understanding technology, take a very pointed stance for a variety of reasons on engaging in dual use conversations where the knowledge that is being requested or the knowledge necessary to train that model to be well suited to certain tasks may have the potential to be used, for what they would deem as like malicious use. Right. And WhiteRabbitNeo is no exception. Ultimately, the censorship there is, we're ultimately asking it to ask red team questions that are offensive security based. These theoretically could be misused by an adversary. And so we take steps aggressively to make sure that it isn't just a weapon. It's really something that is designed to find vulnerabilities and then really empower SecOps professionals, DevSecOps professionals to remediate the vulnerabilities or issues or otherwise like things that it would use from an offensive point of view actively in improving the defenses of the professionals and organizations that are using WhiteRabbitNeo.
Yeah. Okay. So it's about being able to think both sort of offensively and defensively, right? Because your best defense is sort of knowing where your offensive strengths are and kind of protecting against those, and the same with defense. Where's your weaknesses? No, that makes a ton of sense, and I have to imagine the natural way that it would learn, how an Ansible works or a Terraform or anything, in the infrastructure as code space, is to sort of read through manuals, understand the logic behind it, but it's not necessarily thinking about like, well, how would I break this? What's a way in which I could build this to create holes or to sort of systematically start breaking that down? And that's kind of what you're getting at is not only how to use it properly, but also, what things might happen that you might not expect type of things.
Yep, exactly. Okay. Like a good example of like that in practice is that one of the fun examples I like giving on WhiteRabbitNeo, given my background with HashiCorp, is actually looking at identity and access management mismatches between things like Kubernetes and things like Terraform and Vault. Mm-hmm. Very common situation where I have two systems with strong senses of identity and entitlement, and I'm trying to logically define how both of them should interact with a workflow where there's like strict definitions of security. Sometimes things break. And so a very common challenge is how do I figure out where did I write a misconfig somewhere and how do I amend that, either from an over-provisioning or under-provisioning statement. That is something that WhiteRabbitNeo is keenly built to solve and can very quickly remediate as you give it, for example, a pod config and you give it access to your, you give it ACL files and that are basically the HCL of defining what certain vault rules are. But if you want to ask on the flip side of that coin, like a security question on this, that misconfiguration could also constitute an attack. And this kind of goes back to, hey, If I want to be able to like change the context of a DevOps question to a SecOps question and say, hey, how do I harden the system against an attack? I need to understand how to take the knowledge of infrastructure and use it like an adversary would, such that I could then say, here's how I fix it and make sure that future adversaries don't actually launch an attack based on the potential vulnerability.
Yeah, no, it sort of reminds me back in the early days when I was first sort of learning how to write software and understand technology. Somebody sort of said to me like, look, it's about 10% of the code to actually get the functionality, and it's about 80 or 90% of the code to deal with all the sort of error conditions and mistakes that people make or misconfigurations, so the system doesn't blow up. And they're like that, like understanding that dichotomy, is super valuable, because otherwise you think that just the stuff is super easy and you're like, oh yeah, I wrote 20 lines of code or something and it's done. I want to kind of go back to the thinking, the thought process around how do you bring AI into these environments? Is it right now, is it sort of a combination of, intelligently trained models plus some agents that can go off and do autonomous things and build some sort of OODA loops, if you will? Or what's the, what is the sort of framework that AI is taking advantage of these days, or, is right now and maybe is moving towards?
I mean, there seems to be two camps of like where the future goes and looks like. One camp is exactly what you described, right? Where I have a number of models, like a multimodal world, where models that are specifically built for tasks that are very specific to the basis of knowledge for that model combined together to solve a problem. So that's things like WhiteRabbitNeo, maybe in combination with other foundation models like unwinnable Claude, working together to solve a very technical problem. There is also another camp where it's foundation models will dominate unitarily, and you might have a multimodal world, but it's going to look a lot more honestly like how large scale cloud providers work today, where there isn't hundreds of cloud providers. There's really an oligopoly of a set of them that really focus on different kind of infrastructure use cases, et cetera. I think there's probably going to be somewhere in the middle where things are going towards, where you have highly specialized models like WhiteRabbitNeo that are specifically designed and trained for a very specific set of use cases, combining with probably very, very powerful foundation models to solve real problems in the real world. And when it comes from an agentic point of view, yeah, I think we're really in round one for how agents leverage and use generative AI to take advantage of, basically an intelligence that understands and can interpret data. And if you provide it with the right context, can take action on that data to really alleviate and support human beings, especially human beings within DevSecOps that are overburdened and do not have the time and resources to kind of respond to the rapidly scaling nature of infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I think I'm sort of as a follow-up, I'm curious, do you feel like, at least in early conversations you're having with customers, people understand that there is going to be a very distinct difference between models, maybe even smaller models that are distinctly trained for certain tasks and certain activities are going to be useful and valuable versus them sort of believing or expecting that these sort of gigantic frontier state-of-the-art models will kind of have everything in there for them?
Yeah, and for a few reasons. I think first, things like censorship versus uncensorship immediately add a strong dichotomy between what those foundation models do and what something like WhiteRabbitNeo does, right?
Yeah.
If Claude is fantastic, but if I ask Claude to look at this code and then give me a proof of concept for a vulnerability and then tell me how to remediate it, Claude will stop me, right? It'll immediately say, hey, I don't do this kind of stuff. Whereas WhiteRabbitNeo is trained to solve those problems. So I think there are a number of examples of these strong dichotomies that exist. That really ensure that there will be lots of specialized models like WhiteRabbitNeo going forward. But beyond that, I think that one of the questions that we ultimately ask ourselves as a community is, what is the kind of the architecture for how autonomous agents will take use of these models, whether it's a foundation model or one of these kind of focused models like WhiteRabbitNeo. And I think that evolution makes more sense in a world where the agents solve very specific concrete problems, because then leveraging something like WhiteRabbitNeo to, instrument your SIM infrastructure, handle alert fatigue a little bit better, or remove the first three onerous steps of a change management runbook, because it's going to automate that for you and deliver the results to a human being. That's something that it's keenly designed to do. And when you have agents that are very specifically designed to solve specific problems with models that are specifically designed to cater to them, the combination of the two makes it much easier to deliver value rapidly with generative AI versus kind of a larger model that is a kind of jack of all trades, working with a larger jack of all trades set of agents that don't necessarily apply to those specific use cases well.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, and that sort of aligns very much with the way that things in the enterprise tend to work, which is, yes, you understand that we do banking, but we do these things that are very unique to what we do, and our regulations are unique in this industry, this region and that region, and that makes a ton of sense. I want to ask you a last question, and I'm going to ask you for sort of your non-biased hat on this. I've got various friends, in the industry that are known for a long time, security people. And they're inherently, kind of, I don't want to say paranoid, but, they ask a lot of questions about how much of this new AI stuff is real? How much of this is sort of AI washing? Is this new thing that looks like a silver bullet really kind of real? So normal pragmatism. As you're seeing new things come out in the industry around sort of security plus AI, what's the framework that you have in your mind to figure out, is this real? Is it doing something that's sort of new and novel versus just kind of pardon my French, that's just kind of bullshit. It's not really, you know what I mean? I'm curious, if you were talking to someone, you were trying to explain this stuff, and obviously what you guys do is unique to what you do, but how do you help them kind of frame up what to look for versus, kind of what's, just kind of smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, absolutely. So whether it's security or anything else, the question that I ask myself when I look at an advancement in generative AI or a potential new tool or agent or large language model is really, let me step back for a moment. Large language models are fantastic at solving very specifically a directed analytical question on highly relevant structured data.
Mm-hmm.
If one of those things is not related to the question that you're asking or like the problem you're solving, it may not really deliver you a ton of value. It may not be the best solution out there. So going back to the security point of view, there are lots of problems in security are about, hey, I need to have analysis on highly relevant structured data. And if I can give it even more highly relevant structured data, the analysis that I get is better and I can theoretically make a bigger impact. But if it falls outside of that, that framework of what large language models are really designed to do and do well, because these aren't human intelligences, right? This is not you or me, or, I think one of the things that I'm always challenged by is when people talk about large language models and anthropomorphize them and say like, hey, this is just like a human being. It's not like a human being. I look at the structured data and I try to complete the token, right?
Right.
So if it falls within that framework, there is the opportunity for us to add a lot of value in terms of hyperscaling. But if it doesn't fall within that framework, then yeah, I think that there's more than enough basis to be very skeptical of it. And in general, being skeptical of generative AI, just like any other kind of new technology, is not only a good thing, it raises the health. Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly. Well, good stuff. Well, listen, you are a busy man. I know you've got some things to get to. We are very, very appreciative of the time. I appreciate you. I always say this whenever I have folks, especially folks with deep security background. Thank you for putting up with my naive and basic questions, because it helps a ton to help me connect the dots and kind of get a sense of how this stuff all fits together. If folks are interested in diving into this, whether it's the things that you guys do at Kindo around generative AI and DevSecOps and so forth, or the open source project, what's some of the best ways to get engaged with that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. On WhiteRabbitNeo.com, from the open source point of view, is where you can access our tool as well as gain access to its Hugging Face, its repo where it's stored, the source code, et cetera, for it. And then Kindo.com, or Kindo.ai rather, is really where, if you're interested in things like WhiteRabbitNeo and want to learn about how you can apply them in agents that really are designed for DevSecOps, we'd love to help you out. But overall, we're just mostly excited to present a tool to the community that they can, or an intelligence to the community that they can use to build things like Kindo and ultimately, hopefully, improve the calculus towards not attacking defenders from an adversary point of view.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, Andy, thank you again for the time. Folks, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Hopefully this gives you some good starting points as you're thinking about security or using AI for your security postures and so forth. So with that, wrap it up. I want to thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for helping us grow the community around the Cloudcast. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.